This video is brought to you by the lovely guys over at Robotoys. For all your Hasbro, Takara, third-party and knockoff desires, Robotoys has you covered. For 10% off, use the code DrLock 10% off at the checkout. Now on to today's diagnosis.
Read the disclaimer! On the other one, you bastard!
Greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and welcome to part 1 of Seacons Week. Finally, the most anticipated release of 2020 is on my doorstep and ready to review. That said, although I was very excited for this particular combiner, many in the community were quite skeptical. These are retools of Power of the Primes figures, and, well, those original figures left a bad taste in everyone's mouth for sure. And on top of that, releases in America and Canada have been very confusing, as Hasbro Pulse wanted exclusive rights to the last two, so they kind of pestered a lot of American and Canadian stores to not carry the last few Seacons. And on top of that, Hasbro Pulse has decided to massively delay the Seacons, even before that specific event, leaving many in the cold. And to make matters worse, in Australia, EB Games was following the Hasbro Pulse release schedule, not everyone else's. So at the time of recording this, most people in the West have only received Turtler and mainly Golf at this point. Whereas fortunately, I've got all of them thanks to my sponsor today, but I'll get into that jazz later. But the biggest scrutiny would have to be the price. Turtler was $100 and the remaining deluxes were all $60 if we're talking Australian prices. It's a big ask, especially considering these are pre-existing molds, even with the amount of retooling and paint used in them. I understand why they're this expensive. They are manufactured in extremely small numbers compared to most releases, so of course they have to jack up the price. I mean, third party does the exact same thing. But I do very much understand that scrutiny. So the question remains, are they truly worth that price tag? Well, to answer the question, over the course of the next week, we're going to be taking a look at each of the Seacons, and at the end of it all, we're going to be taking a look at the combined mode. So, let's jump into Seacons Week. Okay, so one quick bit of clarification out of the way. I'm going to be using the Japanese names for the remainder of these 7 videos, aside from mentioning what the American ones are here and there just for clarity's sake, although that is very rare anyway. I never grew up with the Seacons, whether in plastic or digital form, so this is my first introduction to the character set. As such, I've become accustomed to referring to them by what's on the box. With that aside, Turtler, or if you insist, Snaptrap, and honestly I think that name better suits a Scraplet more than a Combiner torso, transforms into a beefy f***ing turtle, and it's alright. At least as far as looks are concerned, I do quite like what they are able to pull off with this fella. Right off the bat, they've struck a wonderful balance of mechanical detail and organic echoes, to the point that I say it really outclasses the Beast Combiner elements we got back in Power of the Primes. In fact, any of the Power of the Primes bland list that you're used to seeing, completely gone here. The shell surprisingly has a very nice flow to it, despite being formed from the Combiner chest, 2 guns and a couple of tiny panels. You'd think it wouldn't work, but surprisingly it does. The silver details on the back almost look like vents for releasing smoke after firing the cannons. Speaking of which, the cannons do actually extend. I didn't realize until I was writing this review. It's a very nice touch, but honestly I prefer the more compact version for the turtle mode. It just adds to the beefiness of the design. The head sculpt is absolutely gorgeous in both sculpt work and paint. The jagged edges and the sharp points at the ends hit your subconscious with an incredible ferocity, elevated by the piercing yellow eyes. I often say this, but yellow paint is very hard to do, and I'm very happy they were able to make it work this well. But beyond that, the mouth section is even better. Not only do you have pastel pink on the bottom and sharp silver teeth, but you've also got extra black paint under it, and they even went to the trouble of adding both black and red to the inside of his mouth. And let me tell you, with an open jaw, he's so angry you better let him into the Turtle Club, because if you don't, you'll be turtle food. The front section in general is where I have most of the issues though. For starters, you're only really left with 2 hinges for the head. It makes it woefully under-articulated, and although I get its purpose in robot mode, for the price tag I feel this is a bit of a letdown. A little less frustrating and a little more understandable, but still slightly annoying, is the front leg section. I'm okay with the front legs being this tiny as they have to fold up into the torso, but again I wish they were more articulated. You've only got an inward ball joint, which honestly is the worst way to hinge it. At this point it probably would have been better to give it a swivel and leave it at that. The worst issue out of the whole figure though, and this will cause issues in the combined mode too, is the back leg section. For the most part he retains the same articulation as the Hunger version of this mold, but for some baffling reason the hip rotation is locked far too tight. It's only one way too, the other way works fine, but it feels like with every click I'm slowly destroying the ratchet joint inside. Considering considering this is a key combiner joint, this is incredibly worrisome. A lot of other aesthetic issues I can easily brush aside, but this, I'm sorry, it's just not cool. I've already gone over most of the articulation, but you also get a few rotations in the back legs due to the nature of the arm transformation. That said, it's pretty useless when the front legs do jack shit. Still, it's fine. He's a turtle. What kind of weird poses are you going to put a turtle in? He's a bit of a brick, but at the very least is a nice looking brick. And when it comes to his size, he definitely fills out the price point. If we're taking this by size alone, that already accounts for an extra $10 of the budget, as he easily towers over other Voyagers of the time. Plus, he also comes with several accessories, but for this specific mode, they don't really have that much of a purpose. At least they offer storage for all of them, although it looks pretty ridiculous. And then, comparing him to the original Hunger mold, yeah, there's no contest. I honestly have no idea why anyone, myself included, considered this acceptable. Say what you will about Turtle's front legs, but compared to the front legs of Hunger, compared to the head section, compared to the sticker detail, how was this okay? Well, it was 2018, which I personally consider one of the worst years of Transformers in recent memory. But putting that aside, one thing to note is the difference in the back legs. They've actually been swapped around, so the combined mode isn't left with two giant 5mm pegs on the side, although this means you can't actually store the feet on the sides anymore, and honestly I think that's for the best. Please disregard the last 30 seconds, that is completely false considering the only reason the feet are upside down is because they retooled the entire figure upside down for that, which is why they have the pegs on the other sides, not because they swapped the legs around. That is completely false. Gosh, I'm a f***ing idiot. That said, don't stare at his ass for too long. Wow, I never thought I'd come across a literal head up someone's ass. Turtler is certainly an arrogant fool. Although Turtler's transformation starts off a little bit confusing when you first get it out of the box, especially due to the way the panels and everything move on the top here, after a while it definitely becomes a lot easier. First thing you want to do is untab this section from these two slots over here. You've then got a peg there and a slot there, and the head just slots into that. Make sure that the double hinge is working properly there. Then you rotate these arms down a little bit and rotate them inwards, and that peg should slot into that slot there on each side. For not being a faux part, and for actually being the legs and the head, this is a surprisingly cohesive torso. But anyway, you take this around, rotate it around, and then you've got that slot there and that peg there, and they just peg together for the torso. You're going to want to get these panels open so you can get the legs open, but first off, you want to pull up these guns, rotate them around, and then come around here and slot them back in. That is utterly genius. It allows you to transform the guns around to the other side without the need for parts forming. It's f***ing amazing. Then when that's done, you can actually open up these two panels here, and then untab the legs from these sides here, rotate them around so that they fit in here. But don't fold up the panels just yet. You want to actually undo the legs. They're kind of slotted in there. You just give them a big push, and then you collapse the panels when you're done. You then unfortunately have to undo pretty much the entire thing. You'll notice that the head comes undone, because that will give you access to this back panel. That'll give you access to the head panel here, and then you've got a tab there and a slot there, and those two just peg together. There we go. And then you'll need to actually push the head and everything back in there, the combiner head and everything back in there. It does come undone, and you have to redo it, which is a bit unfortunate, but whatever, it's what has to be done. To get the arms down, you first need to bring these down, and then that'll give you enough clearance to bring these awful ratchets. Oh my god, they are so bad. Jesus, who thought this was a good idea? Ah, Christ. They sound horrible, but when that's done you can orient the arms correctly, uncover the fists with the claws folding back there, and finally the head pops around, along with you pushing these sections back in. And to deny the fact that this is better than the original Hunger mold would be pretty stupid. It easily outclasses it in every single way. No denying it. Ultimately, Turtler's engineering isn't bad, it's just a little clunky in places given the poor tolerances and issues carried over from being a Hunger retool. I don't hate it by any means though, the end result is decent. I don't think it's the best torso I've ever come across, but it's definitely solid for what it is. Now, right out of the transformation, this is the configuration you'll have it in. It may seem a bit messy though, with the giant backpack and the guns on the side, even if I personally don't mind them. However, Takara have given you the option to parts form these pieces in a manner similar to the G1 toy, placing the cannons on the back and using the combined chest as a shield. Honestly though, I don't see this configuration as an improvement, more as a different option that is equally valid. Still, for fans who are especially nostalgic for the G1 toy, this should be right up your alley, and keeping it in the stock configuration would seem blasphemous blasphemous. Whatever the case, it's nice that they at least give you an option between lack of parts forming and G1 accuracy. Now in person, the chest definitely seems oversized, but once you've had it in hand, it doesn't really bother you. I appreciate that they actually managed to use the turtle mass to form it instead of using a faux part. Now don't get me wrong, I by no means hate faux parts, at least to the extent of other YouTubers. That said, I do understand the disdain for them, and when the designers at least attempt to make use of alt mode mass, it is quite commendable. The head sculpt is incredibly mean, coming across as a berserker version of Hotspot or Inferno. I do feel it's a smidge too small though, and this is one instance where I feel the original Hunger mold did something better. In general though, Turtler is a massive step up from the deeply disappointing original. That said, there is one element that I feel it massively falls short: the paint. You do get a little bit of paint on the thighs for color correction purposes, and aside from this section that came pre-chipped out of the box, which seems to be a QC issue, chipping doesn't seem to be a problem. But everywhere else is just left in the dust. The legs and arms pretty much have nothing, and on certain color schemes that works, but on a neon one like this you really have to break it up, lest you become like the Siege Rainmakers. Ugh. To clarify, I really do love the overall color scheme, but there's just something missing here. Even if they had to allocate a decent chunk of the budget into the combined mode, with the color correction on the back of the arms to make the combined thighs pink, and the luscious chrome that will end up looking really good later, there just really needs to be something for the legs and especially the arms. I mean, look at these shoulders, they've got nothing! Now, I'm fully aware that Repro Labels is currently working on a kit for these, but bottom line is you shouldn't need them to make this look good, especially if you're paying this much. Overall, Turtler does fill out his price tag, but this is one element that falls short, and unfortunately I do have to bring it up. Thankfully, one section that is painted quite well is the accessories. Is the worst segue ever written. First, you get a sword. This sword is absolutely lovely and instantly makes the figure look 10 times more awesome just by holding it. It's highly unlikely anyone's going to display this in robot mode since the beast and combined modes seem far more popular, but on the off chance you do, then you need to pose him with this. And funnily enough, this actually builds on a concept that I've been asking for over a great period of time. Now, does anyone remember this scene from my Siege Astro Train review? The idea of combining weapons sounds cool, but until hashtags start working on the combined mode first and then going backwards instead of just half-assing it, it's not a feature that I or many others will care about. Well, funnily enough, this is actually the base for a massively combined trident. I'm not saying that all weapons are done as well as the sword here, but this treatment of the combined weapon is a massive improvement over other attempts done recently. This feels more in line with Iron Factory Bruticus's gun than whatever Astro Train attempted. The next weapon we get is a massive gun, which feels similar to what Silverbolt came with, although not done as well. You get all these ports on the side, and I think they're supposed to hold all the bot weapons together, but so far I can't make heads or tails of it. Quite literally, considering half the weapons are actually tails. Seems like this was an afterthought more than anything. The gun itself isn't anything special either. If anything, it looks a little too busy, even ignoring all the ports all over it. But if you don't like this gun, there's an option to use the feet as turret attachments instead. They actually split and fold, and the end result doesn't actually look too bad. Furthermore, if you don't fold them at all, they make very nice forearm-mounted Gatling guns. You can even use the leftover foot attachments to turn them into claws. This is just the right amount of endearingly stupid, and I absolutely love it. Matter of fact, this is my preferred configuration for robot mode. It's just so goofy and it's incredibly awesome. And if that still wasn't enough, the combined chest shield hides extra weapons of its own. You can actually remove the chrome parts as they're on 5mm pegs, and they clip into the sides of the wrists in a similar manner to Blandy McBlandface from the Assassin's Creed series. I'm not sure if this was intentional or not, but it's surprisingly striking and just adds to the massive pile of weapon options. If there's one part I wish they'd added to truly bring the piece together, it's the compatibility of the cannons on his legs. I wish there was a way to plug them in, either into his hands or on the sides of the forearms. Sadly, there's no pegs at all in terms of the latter, and the former, well, they just aren't long enough. Still, aside from that, the weapon loadout is more than acceptable. The only other complaint that I could possibly have is that the combiner ports are completely visible on the knees. Hunger was able to cover them up with some clever panels, but due to the switchable ports on the sides, they opted out on this version. It's a minor shame, but one I have to mention nonetheless. Articulation is pretty standard for the time the original mold came out, although with a couple of changes. The head is on a ball joint and it gets some rather limited side to side and up and down. The shoulders, as I mentioned, are on awful forward ratchets that I hope won't break before this review cycle is over. The outward ones thankfully work quite well though, and the bicep swivels and 90-degree elbows function without issue. Sadly, there's no wrist swivel or waist swivel, but this is both a combiner and based on an older mold, so I can give it a pass. Almost everything below the waist is pretty stock standard for this mold. Universal hips ratcheted in both directions, thigh swivels and double jointed knees. They're sadly stopped by the new kibble pieces though, which is a slight shame, but understandable when considering both the turtle and combined mode. The feet are a little different from the original though. Now we've got a hinge and a ball ball joint instead of just an ankle tilt. I kind of prefer the way the original one worked since it was slightly sturdier, but the newer version does result in less hollowness and the posability is slightly better. All in all, not the best articulation, but still perfectly understandable given the circumstances of this figure's creation. Now, size-wise, he's about as big as you'd expect for this figure, although somehow, and I don't know how this is possible, he ends up being slightly taller than the original mold. You'd think the retooled feet would have made him slightly shorter, but nope. I mean, that's neither here nor there, but it is interesting. But whilst I think he's easily better than the original mold, I still feel Silverbolt does this design a lot better. Now, keep in mind, according to official word from Hasbro, Hunger is not in fact a retool of Silverbolt. He simply copies the same ideas and transformation scheme, whilst being designed from the ground up. That said, it's clear where the evolution started, and I still think Silverbolt is a more solid and better executed toy. But that doesn't throw any shade at Turtler. He's still done incredibly well. Not perfectly, but still incredibly well. So unfortunately, Turtler is not perfect. For all the amazing things he does, he's still incredibly lacking in paint, and these ratchets are just awful. So I can't quite give him a full 5 out of 5, but he is still quite amazing. And aside from those two issues, a lot of the other issues can be forgiven, because he does have to combine at the end of the day. And the fact that they were able to integrate so many parts without creating a new mold, without much parts forming, is highly commendable. If nothing else, he's a brilliant start for the Seacons journey, and that's all you can really ask for. But before I get going and onto the next Seacons, it's time for a sponsored message. Today's video is brought to you by Robotoys. They specialize in Hasbro, Takara, third-party, and knockoff figures. Don't forget, if you haven't already, use the code DrLock 10% off for 10% off a single purchase. The Seacons aren't available at the moment, but Takara may reissue them at some point, and we may very well get a God Neptune down the line, who knows. But that aside, make sure to tune in tomorrow when we take a look at the first of the many Limbots. Is the $60 price tag truly worth it, as much as the $100 one was? Catch you later.
타거라 타거라 돈나 토라 No no カメカメコーラ自慢のぶちかまし強い子売り子